Anthropometry as a term, anthro refers to humans and metry simply refers to measurements. So it's the field of science that is concerned with measuring distances, lengths of the human body, and that also catalogs what is the amount of deviation from the average. This is a tool. This is like literally a cheating tool. Like if you've always had trouble because of you're using references or simply highly distorted, anthropometry is a sanity check that you can use to make sure that you are working at a proper scale and that you are not suffering from any issues related to perspective distortion on your own 3D model. So let's get started then. So this is what anthropometry is. The first question that people usually ask is, okay, so like what's the best reference that I can find as far as anthropometry is concerned? So there's no like one thing that is the best reference ever as far as anthropometry is concerned, because anthropometrical measurements changes based on ethnicity, based on gender, based on age, but there still is some references that we can still consult as a good starting point on the topic. And so I present to you the 2012 Anthropometric Survey of U.S. Army Personnel Methods and Summary Statistics. Now, the reason why I'm starting with this is pretty much because, first, I consider it to be a very good reference on the topic. It's not complete, but there is a lot of information to go through in here. And second of all, it's in the public domain. This actually comes from the U.S. Department of Defense. You can actually easily find it online simply by typing Department of Defense, so DoD and then anthropometry. I'm sure I'm on a list somewhere, and you will be too. This kind of topic is of particular interest to the Department of Defense. Let's be honest, they probably don't spend their days sculpting 3D characters. The reason why this is interesting for them is really because as government body, I guess, that creates or has to manufacture a whole bunch of helmets, suits, trucks, and what have you there. They simply have to know, like, okay, like if we want to make a helmet that fits on almost every head, how big does the helmet need to be, you know? Like, it's a very simple question when you really think about it, you know, and you could answer the question by being like, well, I guess just take whoever is a researcher and put a helmet on them and make sure that it fits, you know? And if you find a researcher that has a very, very, very average head, I suppose that something like that could work, you know? But, you know, that you need to have a very large pool to make sure that you are indeed extracting what would be somewhat average measurements there. If you find something that is more Western oriented as far as anthropometrical data, that data will be applicable for a subset of the population, but it will not be applicable for everyone worldwide there. So you always kind of have to think of like take every notion of anthropometry that you see left and right with a grain of salt, if you will. Depending on the kind of face that you are sculpting, you will probably want to do a more pointed research for anthropometrical data that would relate as best as it possibly can to the head that you are currently sculpting on. The whole field of anthropometry really starts by simply defining different landmarks for face or for the rest of the body. Every little bump that we have, most of them are created by the bony structure. I guarantee you that if there's a bump that is common across the population, that there is a researcher somewhere that spent their time to give it a name and to really figure out what it was and like what is the exact precise location of it. So the moment that you really start to really delve into these different landmarks and what have you, like you start to discover a whole new language. Who knew that the furthest point of the cranium, the name of it is the this thing here, ipsitocranian. I guess I never even tried to pronounce that before. Ipsitocranian. And here's the point that's called the autobasian. I have no idea what these things usually are. And I consider that I know my anatomy very, very well. And even then, like, there's a lot of these that at some point you just kind of give up. You know, I believe that knowing terms is often good because it helps for communication when you talk with someone else. You know, there's nothing worse than saying like, oh yeah, you know, the muscle under the outer muscle that's behind that sort of bony thing there. So I'm actually a big believer in like learning names of stuff. But there's also kind of a limit to it, you know. There's a point where learning names just becomes a bit superfluous, you know. So anthropometry really starts with this. It starts with first defining what are the important facial landmarks, and after that, or for the full body there, and after that, then essentially researchers just go with a bunch of calipers and other measuring tools like these, and simply measure that across the whole population. Once you start to look more at anthropometry data, it's more or less always listed as a breakdown of measurements based on percentiles. And so you would have the mean of the population aggregating probably around the 50th percentile. The average is not the mean, so 50th percentile doesn't mean that it's the average of the population. The point being that we can really usually trust these figures as really nice ballpark figures. If we take a look at this here, right, so this is for head breadth. So the head breadth is measured at the widest point of the cranium there. So if you look at a cranium, there's a little bump here. And so this bump here is called the parietal eminence, and this is more or less the widest point of the head. Why is it interesting, and why do people get this wrong? Because when you look at images, when you look at a picture of someone, like a portrait of someone, the field of view of the camera will make it so that the front of the face will have a tendency to simply look as if it is wider than what is happening on the back there. And therefore, it is very misleading. If you only look at references and you don't really ponder the question of what is the largest point of the head, really, you may have a tendency to make the front of the face overly large in relation to the back of the face. So here, head breadth then, so the maximum width of the head. The average, therefore, for females, according to this document, is 14.70 centimeters. And for males, it would be 15.4 centimeters. So that's already kind of interesting. Like, you can already see that there's a little bit less than a centimeter difference. I suppose we could average these two values down to 15 centimeters. And also interesting is that we can see that there is deviation here from the 50th percentile. Let's say that we take this measurement here for females. So we see 14.70. And we go down to all the way down to 13.70 for the second percentile, really. So there's about a centimeter difference towards the smaller side, if you will. And then inversely, we are at more or less 1 centimeter above where we were before, right? So we have a range. What this gives us really is a range of 2 centimeters from smallest head, if you will, to largest head, which means that if you're working on the head and you're not really sure what would be the actual exact width of the head that you have, it's very safe to try to limit yourself to that range there that we're talking about. And even then, it's good to be closer to the middle more than further to the extremities, because it actually creates a bell curve if you were to look at this graph there. This is good because it really defines a sandbox in which you can play, really. You really have to think about it that way. It's like, this is the sandbox. I have about 2 centimeters of play for the width of my head there. If we go to Zbrush and we use that kind of data, how do we go about measuring this? So here I am in Zbrush. I'm using the transpose line, which doubles as a ruler. So once again, you can access the transpose line by simply pressing W, E, or R on your keyboard if you're using the default shortcuts, which will likely give you the 3D gizmo as a default. And then you simply have to press Y on your keyboard to switch the 3D gizmo over to the transpose line. And the thing that the transpose line does that the gizmo does not is that it allows you to measure. So if I click and drag here from one widest point to the other one, and I look at my measurements here, so we are at about 14.3 centimeters right now, which is more or less pretty much exactly within the range. And it's comfortably detached from the extremities as well, Like, the moment that you have a measurement of some kind and you're really getting close to the one end of the spectrum or the other one, there's a chance that this is a very significant measurement or outlier, if you will, for this particular face, So how do you use anthropometrical measurement then in your own workflow? You use anthropometrical measurement to act as a bit of a sanity check when you are making heads, right? So really, like in this case here, measuring the head breadth is really just a way to make sure that through our sculpting, we haven't broken that 15 centimeter average or a very rough ballpark figure, right? It's very easy as you're sculpting a head to at some point just be sculpting the head and then being like adding or removing information on the surface. You're just happily sculpting and just having some fun. And then at some point you kind of wind up with something maybe that kind of looks like this here, maybe in terms of width, It may not be immediately apparent that there's something wrong. If I'm here and I start to measure this here, I use my transpose line again, and I take a look at this, now I'm at 13.5. It's like, okay, like it doesn't sound too bad, right? And certainly if we compare with the data, we're technically within this range, but at this point I'm pretty much like between the first and the second percentile there. And it doesn't seem like it would make a difference, but it really does, because like you really add a few of these measurements. You don't do it only once, you do it multiple times. And now we're at about 14.11. We're a lot closer to the middle of the spectrum there. So I already feel a lot better about that. What's important to know at this point? Because if you go through this, you'll see a hell of a lot of information there that is related to anthropometry and head measurement. There's quite a lot of stuff in here. It's like it probably, I don't know, maybe like at least over 100 different measurements. Not all related to the face, but there is a lot of those that is related to the face there. So which ones are really the most important ones for you to know, really? Head breadth is number one in terms of important measurements. Second one, head length, which is more or less the depth, if you will, so from front all the way to back. And you pretty much go from what we call the glabella, which is the space here, right here on your forehead, just over the little depression that you may have here at the nose. So right over the nose bridge, this zone here, we call that the glabella. And so from here all the way to the furthest point of the cranium there, the thing that I forgot the name already, the opistocranian, this thing from the glabella to that point there. So for females, once more, 50th percentile here, about 19. Let's see here, so 18.42. All right, that's not too far. I guess I haven't done too bad of a job with this head. Places us about here, so at about the 20th to 25th percentile. I feel pretty good about that. So next, we have head height, right? From chin all the way to the top. What is the height of the head? Now, unfortunately, in this document, there is no one measurement that does that. So we kind of more or less have to combine two different measurements together to reach that particular analysis of whether our head is high enough, but that's totally fine, really. On page 165, you have the menton to cilium length. The menton, what we call the menton, is simply the lowest point of the chin. It's about here or so, right? That's the menton. And you go from here all the way to, where are we going with this? We are going to the cilium. The cilium is pretty much the upper extremity of the nose bridge. And from here to here then, what is our 50th percentile? It's about 11.30. All right, where are we? 10.5. Ah, maybe that's a pretty big deviation. 10.5, we should be at about 11.30. So 10.5 puts us at about 10th percentile. And maybe that's starting to be a little too low, right? Maybe that's uncomfortably low. I mean, again, we are within what is technically correct, you know, like it's not a mistake at all, because we are certainly within average human values. But the question still remains, you know, like, is this part of the essence of the character? When you're at 10%, you could start to consider it as a bit of an outlier. And therefore, the question then is this measurement being significant to the kind of character that I want to build, you know? So that's the first one when it comes to measuring the total height of the head, but we are still missing from here all the way to the top. So the second thing that I propose is from the tragus or the trachon. So from trachon all the way to top of the head, how much do we have again? 50th percentile, about 12.70. What is the deviation from that? This would be closer to what we call 2 SD, so 2 standard deviations. And we could expect about 1.5 centimeters or so. So this one is actually quite varied, right? From here to there, and from here to here, it's about 1.5 or so. So 1.5 with 12.70 being the average there. Cool. Let's go from here all the way to the top. Also significant, perhaps, you have to be careful with this here. It's not just from here to here as much as it is the actual height in this particular case, right? Which means that in ZBrush, I don't want to simply be clicking here and then clicking there for my transpose line, because you can see that it's going to angle my transpose line, which does make a pretty big difference. So in this case here, I want to click on the trachon, and when I'm making my transpose line, when I'm drawing it, so I disable perspective, I make my transpose line from trachon all the way to the top of the head, and I'm holding shift all the while I'm doing it. So the moment that I release my cursor, because I have pressed down shift, this will give me the actual height following the vertical axis. Yeah, so here, how much do we have? About 12.24. Which I believe, again, is pretty solid here. It's pretty close to the average there. So our proportions there are pretty good. All right, so we've looked at head depth, head width, and head height. What else do we have that's interesting? Bizygomatic breadth. Also very, very, very important. So this is one that we have at something we call the Zygyon or Zygyon. This image is probably a better image to look at than this one here if you want to see exactly where it is. The Zygyon or Zygyon is simply the widest part of what we call the zygomatic arch. Now, if you've never heard zygomatic arch before, it's simply the scientific term for the cheekbone. So the widest point of the cheekbone. It's pretty much what it comes down to. And again, it begs the question. So where is that necessarily in terms of depth, right? Because if we're looking at it at an image of a head from front view, it's like saying that this is where the widest point of the cheeks are. It can be very misleading when you really think about it. Like if you're here and you're like, okay, so the widest point of the cheek would be, I guess, here. If you're not very careful about this, you will likely put what should be the widest point of the cheeks a bit too far forward when it actually needs to be a bit further back. Let's measure it and see what happens here. So 13.1, okay, that's what I have here. Let's compare it with our anthropometrical data. And so 50th percentile here, zygomatic breadth 13.4. Here I had 13.2, pretty much on the average. Into pupillary breadth, extremely important. And so this is simply the distance between the pupils. If you've studied anatomy in books, especially drawing books, what you've heard is that you should be able to fit more or less 5 eyes onto head there, in terms of distances. So here's eye number 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, and this would be 5, right? So you're supposed to be able to fit more or less 5 eyes. It's not a bad way to go about measuring things, and especially if you're drawing. I mean, when you're drawing, you can't just break out a ruler and start to measure stuff like what we're doing now, of course. So because we have anthropometrical data as to how wide an eyeball is, how wide the palpebral fissure is, which is the opening of the eyelids themselves. We have anthropometrical data about distance between the eyes. So we have all of that data, really. And when you really look at the data, you kind of realize that simply saying you should be able to fit one eye between the 2 eyes and then one eye on the outside of that. And, when you start looking at a bunch of references online, you start to realize that it's not necessarily a bad way to go about like just having a very rough approximation of your eyes there. But there is a lot of cases where it's not technically true. Like she has slightly more than one eye between her 2 eyes, and she has slightly less than one eye on the outside there. So this is really, really good to really measure this as well. So here we have about, for females here, 50th percentile, 6.2. And then we have more or less about 8.8 centimeter. Of variability there, right? Okay, so how much do we have here for our interpupillary distance? From here to here, we are at 6 centimeters exactly, which brings us down to the 30th percentile. I'm quite happy with that. So, okay, let me throw a few different things your way. So these are less anthropometrically precise, what I'm about to tell you guys, but they're still very, very relevant and very important for you to measure and to pay attention to. Anyway, so this is what we call the palpebral fissure. So the palpebral fissure, so what's interesting about it is the relationship between the palpebral fissure or the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid as they relate to the iris. This is something you want to pay attention to when you're sculpting heads, because if you're not getting this relationship right, your head will not look good, but what is more likely to happen is that your head will simply look as if it has an expression that you may not want to have, In an average way, the upper eyelid more or less crosses at the halfway mark between the top of the pupil opening and the top part of the iris there, the higher border there. And the bottom eyelid more or less comes in contact with the iris. You can see how the bottom of the iris border is exactly in contact with the lower lid there. And this is true for these 2 references here. If you're not getting that relationship like what I just described, and you make the upper eyelid higher than the top border of the iris, you run the risk of giving a surprised look to your character. And if you do the opposite, if your iris, or rather if the upper part of the pupil border, if you will, is too close to the eyelid, then you run the risk of making your character look sleepy or uninterested. It just so happens that my pupils here are simply way too dilated. That's something I'd have to fix on this particular head. But other than that, the eyelids are in the proper location in relation to the iris and the eyeball there.